Well, after the first film, Clive got in touch with you, didn't he, to help write the second installment. How did all that come about?
Well, obviously, we'd stayed close friends.
Yeah,
I left the company not because I wasn't happy with the dog company, but I still had that itch to be a rock and roll star.
I see.
Another mate of mine from school was just on at me, always come back to Liverpool, form a band with me. Come on, there's a huge because it was like the at the time the Enemy and the Melody Maker called it the second wave of Mersey beat. You know, Mersey beat was a phrase they'd coined for the Beatles,
Beatles and stuff. Yeah,
all that stuff. And so this is the late 70s, early 80s. And there was, in other words, there was us, and then there was all the bands you've actually heard of, like Echo and the Bunnymen, and Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and Teardrop Explodes, which was Julian Cope's band. Another Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. They were actually from Birkenhead, but we're not. So it really was. There really was a scene happening in Liverpool, of which I hasten to assure you, we were no part at
all. Right.
We scratched a living paying pubs and clubs for a couple of years, and it was great. It was a lovely thing to have done. But anyway, that's what were you actually asking me, as opposed to? Oh, yeah. So yes. Clive and I obviously had stayed close friends, and me and Doug and Phil and Lynn and Sue and Julie and all the other people had stayed friends. And prior to the first Hellraiser, obviously Clive's first success was with the Books of Blood. So, we'd all been there for the launch of that and the party and everything. And when Hellraiser happened, Clive had a couple of movies filmed from screenplays of his, but not directed by him. And I don't think I'm telling tales out of school, because he's certainly mouthed off about it himself, to say he wasn't overly pleased with that's for the completists, that's Rawhead Rex and Transmutations or Underworld. It depends which country you're in at a different time. So, having already made The Forbidden with me, so he knew he could direct, he wanted to find a way to write and direct. And somebody whose praises aren't really sung often enough in the How Did Hellraiser Happen story is there was a young guy, I think 2 years younger than me, 3 or 4 years younger than Clive, and his name was Chris Figg. And I think Clive and he just met at a mutual friend's dinner the one time. Chris wanted to be a movie producer, and Chris was a posh kid, much posher than us Liverpool oiks, but he'd really decided to learn the ropes. He'd crewed, he'd worked. I'll get the actual positions wrong, but the equivalent of it, he was clapper loader, second assistant camera runner. He'd done the homework, so he knew the nuts and bolts of how movies are actually made, as opposed to idiots in suits who think they're producers. And so him and Clive, it was a great connection. And it was really thanks to Chris's calm and insistence that Hellraiser even happened, because they'd tried to get funding from some British sources, from some European sources, and some American sources, and it had not been working. And the most interest they had was from New World Pictures, which, again, for the horror geeks among us, is legendary, because it used to be Roger Corman's company, Roger Corman, who we lost just earlier this year, sadly. Roger Corman had founded New World in, I don't know, mid-70s or something. And by now, Roger had been bought out, so it wasn't his company. But Chris and Clive went in to pitch it, and I wasn't in the room, so I'm always tempted to dramatize this and make, Clive doing a really bad job, and then Chris came in. But Clive pitched it. I'm sure he pitched it brilliantly, of course. I'm joking about the bad job. But for whatever reason, they didn't bite. And the meeting was essentially over. And Clive, as the polite young man he'd been brought up by his lovely parents, Joan and Les, Joan and Len, to be, said, "Oh, well, thank you very much," and was ready to go. And Chris said, "No, hold on." And again, I wasn't in the room, but Chris just, I want to say bullied him into it, but he talked him into it. He had a steely glare and talked like Prince Charles, unlike us yobs. And I don't know if that helped, or he just knew what he was talking about in terms of the finance package that would be required. Anyway, all I want to say is it was thanks to Chris Figg that Hellraiser got made. I'm not saying Clive's genius wouldn't have shown up somewhere else, but Chris was the guy who got it going. So Chris and Clive stayed as producing partners for the company they formed called Film Futures, and they wanted to do a sequel, but Clive was not interested in writing and directing the sequel. In fact, Chris was trying to set up a Harry de Moore movie for Clive to write and direct, which is not, it wasn't The Last Illusion, which became Lord of Illusions 10 years later. I think it was the same character, Harry de Moore, but it was an original. So they needed somebody else. And neither Tony Randall, who eventually became Hellraiser 2's director, nor me, who eventually became Hellraiser 2's writer, we were not the first choice, because I don't know what the connection, professional or personal, was, but a really good writer called Michael McDowell, a horror author who'd written the Blackwater books and various other things, and very good. But also, most of the point, he's written Beetlejuice, which Tim Burton had directed.
Right, yeah.
Movie. So Michael was, I don't want to use the phrase flavor of the month, but he was a hot property in.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, in bigger movies than Hellraiser, for God's sake. But so no contracts were ever signed, but I know that Chris and Clive approached Michael to write and direct Hellraiser 2. And then, and this is not a cute story, I'm sorry. It ends up very luckily for me and Tony Randall. But Michael's partner, Michael's boyfriend, became extremely ill. So for personal reasons, that could not proceed. I hope I'm not telling stories I'm not meant to tell, or I don't know. Michael himself, sadly, we lost many years later. And as I say, it's not like a contract had been signed or any ideas had been come up. But that's another alternate track of history. Anyway, so at that point, thank God I'd stayed nice to Clive, because at that stage, Chris said, "Well, shit, do we know anybody else?" And Clive said, "Well, I do know a guy." Anyway, so he called me and said, I mean, he'd read some fiction I'd written. So he knew I could string a sentence together. And he knew, in a weird way, because of our tiny little indie filmmaking activities, that I was fairly familiar with the fact that you point a camera at the person saying the lines. Anyway, so yeah, that was it. Obviously I guess I didn't realize I was auditioning because they were all very tactful about it, but obviously I think Chris had to approve it as well. I think Clive gave them to read. So again, Chris knew, well, he's right in English. But I had a meeting with him, and I always used to tell the story just for humorous effect, that Clive and I put one over on Chris, that we told Chris that I knew how to write scripts. And of course, I didn't know how to write scripts, but any idiot can learn the format of a script. The trick, here's a tip for you kids out there who want to do it. The trick to screenwriting is thinking in pictures. What are you seeing? Don't get in your characters' heads. Have them do something. So if you have a natural instinct to think in pictures, the formatting is very unimportant. And despite the joke versions I've told about us putting one over on Chris, we didn't put one over on Chris at all. Chris is an extremely smart and enthusiastic guy, and he responds well to smartness and enthusiasm in others. Which I realize is sort of back and complimenting myself, because I guess I'm saying I must have been smart and enthusiastic. But, like so many of these things, Sean, it's really chemistry. Like you get on with people, not in some sort of magic, suddenly we saw visions, but you just sort of, it's like, oh, yeah, we can work with this guy. We can talk, we get each other's jokes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was still in the band in Liverpool, although we were failing by then. I think we were trying to line up, and I was essentially on the dole. And suddenly, Chris brings me down to London, puts me up in a very nice hotel in Hampstead, and says, "There you go. Can I have a script in 3 weeks?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then I wrote Hellbound on a manual typewriter. And what I want to know is, I mean, because again, I'm not pretending the Hellraiser movies were big budget studio movies, but they were legit theatrical release movies. I wonder if Hellraiser 2, was the last theatrical feature to be written on a manual typewriter. Now, I know it's probably not, because there's lots of quirky buggers who probably still write on a manual typewriter today. But in terms of I not knowing any better, I wonder if Hellbound was the last manual typewritten script. By the second draft, somebody lent me a computer.
Right.
The first draft was delivered on a manual typewriter. And again, before I end my praise of Chris Figg, who, as I say, does not get talked about enough in Hellraiser saga, he gave me the best and gentlest advice. I think it was our second meeting. We'd had a get to know you meeting, and then it was when I moved, when they brought me down, when I was just about to be installed in the Hampstead Hotel. We had a chat about it. I'd run the story by him, and then just as I was leaving, he hadn't been in any way producerial or interfering, and then just as I was leaving, he said, "Oh, Pete," and I turned back, and he said, "I don't want to see any dialogue that's longer than that on the page." And I thought, oh, okay, because that wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me. Now, weirdly, the first dialogue in Hellbound is a fucking long monologue by Chad as he's cutting the woman's brain. So I can't remember if that was just bloody-minded, oh yeah, not longer than I or just coincidence. Or maybe I'd started it differently in the first draft, I can't remember. But it was good advice. Because, of course, you can have monologues, you can have voiceovers, you can have all the things that they tell you can't. But that was just it was just a useful, pragmatic thing for Chris to say. It just reminded me, right, yeah, it's not Shakespeare. We're not going to monologue at each other. These are modern people or monsters talking rapidly back and forth. And that was a good piece of practical advice. Thank you, Chris.
How did the story come together? Because I know that, like you said, Clive had taken a bit of a back seat after the first film.
I don't think he'd like the phrase back seat, but yes. in terms of writing and directing, yes, he didn't do that. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry. Well, he worked with you on the story, didn't he? So how did that develop?
Oh yeah. Sorry, that was before. Not before the first meeting was, I can't remember, but I was back in Liverpool with the band, as I was saying. Clive was still in London.
Yeah.
So yes, once, it must have been after Chris had given me the thumbs up, I guess, or we wouldn't have wasted our time. I went down to Clive's, and it was great. It was sort of like the Dog Company again, because I arrived at the house he was living in with John at that point, John Gregson. And there's a bottle of whiskey already opened, so that was handy. And so we just sat, and obviously Clive had ideas already, he made the first one and had, various dangling plot threads that could be picked up. And so as we used to in Dog Company, we brainstormed. We just sat, literally finished the bottle of whiskey, which I couldn't fucking do now. And we were healthy young men, neither of us were worse than were the next morning, but we finished the whiskey and finished the story, finished the plot. By the time, I think it was literally just one night stay, I went back to Liverpool on the train the next day, and on the same manual typewriter that I was later to write the script on, I wrote what they call a treatment, which is the story of the movie. All writers hate treatments because it's flavorless shit. It's just like, this happens, then this happens. We learn that they are actually a secret agent. This happens, So I went back and I wrote up a 10-page, I'm guessing might have been 5, might have been 15, a 10-page treatment. And that's what we sent to Chris after my first meeting with him and before the second. And just to dot the I's and cross the T's, that was it's not like Clive just said, write me a sequel, and I came up with everything. We jammed on it. Obviously we had the danglers of where's Frank, what happened to Larry. So we just, the way you do, we sat in the well, what if, and we'd come up with it by the end of that night, as I say, and then I wrote it up on the 10 pages, and obviously, if I didn't remember exactly what Clive and I had said, I made it up. But it went to Chris and Clive, at which point, Clive could have said, hang on, we didn't say there was a cameo for you in this, or whatever. And similarly, Chris could have given notes, and I'm sure Chris did give notes, but they will have been smart and to the point. And there was never a second treatment. I didn't have to do another version. There were just a few notes. And then he basically commissioned the script. So yes, what was it? It was interesting that, yes, Clive took a backseat in terms of he did no writing on the movie and he did no directing on the movie. His credit, I think, is executive producer. But the story, as opposed to the execution of the story, the script and the direction, the story was by me and him. And actually, the truth is, if this was I don't think either Clive or I, you have to basically write one movie before you qualify to get into the Writers Guild. And once you're in the Writers Guild, there are certain rules and regulations that protect the screenwriter. And the truth is, if it had been a Guild picture, well, actually, it wouldn't, because, again, there was nothing on paper except what I wrote. In fact, if it had been a Guild picture, I would have got even more credit than I did. But what I was actually going to say, the truth, as opposed to vanity credits, is the story of Hellraiser 2 is really me, Clive, and Tony Randall. Tony didn't come on until 3 drafts in. I'd already done, had I done 3? I think 3. But he and I really connected immediately as well once he was brought over. And so although, again, I was the only one writing up what we talked about, Tony had a lot of input into reshaping it was pretty much the same story, but I couldn't do the math. I was going to say there's as much Tony Randall in the story as there is Clive Barker. That's probably not quite true, because the story, the through line, is what Clive and I came up with. But again, I don't want to downplay Tony's input. What was the question?
That's pretty much it. I was going to ask you, actually. So obviously we learn Pinhead's backstory, don't we? We find out who it was previous, and I know it was
not so much in number 2. Oh, did you say number 3, or did?
We're leading into 3, yeah. So
We see him as a British officer clearly of a certain period, but we don't have a name or a backstory until number 3.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you say it because, it was. I don't think I came up with the name Elliot Spencer until number 3, but the whole notion that he was one of the lost generation who turned to the box in metaphysical despair was sort of born there. And it gave Doug an opportunity to put on a fancy uniform and face. So, yeah.
When you were on set, did you go on set quite often? I guess you did, yeah?
Yeah. Not continuously on Hellbound. Hellraiser 3, which we shot a couple of years later in North Carolina, I was there throughout. Wishmaster, I was there throughout. Bloodline, I visited once or twice. And Hellbound, I came down at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, and then I think because it was my first writing gig and it was Tony's first directing gig, and was it 10 days before the end, 2 weeks before the end? I'm not sure, but I got a call from Chris Fig, and he said, "You got to come down and hold Tony's hand to help him drag this thing over the finish line." And it wasn't that they didn't want me to come down and rewrite anything or fix anything. I think it really was this, so Tony had a mate.
Right.
I think he's told the story himself, and I think the way he always puts it is, if I knew Pete was standing there, I could turn to him and say, "Why did we do this?" Or something. So I was there for the end of it. I was there quite a lot, but not continuously. You can always tell what it is I didn't get one of those fancy, I don't know what they call them, the bit you put on the back of a folding chair.
Oh, with your name on it.
Name stitched on it. So, I've got a fancy one of them from Wishmaster, but I do not have a Hellraiser 2 chair back. So so that's how you can tell I wasn't there all the time.
I was still during the film because I know it was in makeup for a long time, wasn't it? It was hours before you could go on set. Did you speak to him at all during that time?
I'd bring him a ciggy, often, yes. If I was there, I would sit there while. I don't know if I'm sure if people are watching this because they're interested in the Hellraiser stuff, they've probably seen the picture. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a great one of. Sorry, I'll give you some backstory to it. I always loved when I was a little preteen horror movie fan, reading Famous Monsters of Filmland. You would occasionally see these behind-the-scenes photos of Boris Karloff, Frankenstein's monster, and Elsa Lanchester, the bride of Frankenstein, backstage. The cast of those Frankenstein movies was nearly all Brits, and so 4:00, it was tea time. Whatever the American crew might have thought. And so you've got backstage pictures of Elsa Lanchester in the bride hair. You know what I'm talking about? The cup of tea and a ciggy. And there's ones of Karloff leaning against the slab, cup of tea and a ciggy. And it was not consciously posed to imitate that, but one of my favorite backstage I think it's from Hellbound. It might be from the first one. But anyway, it's Doug with the pinhead makeup on, but in a dressing gown, cup of tea and a ciggy. And, so, I would obviously I'd hang back and talk with him because it was a long process. Jeff Portas was the brilliant makeup guy who designed and applied the makeup on the first 2. So... And then Bob Keane did it himself for Hellraiser 3, and then Gary Tunnicliffe took over, I think, from Hellraiser 4 on. But the image animation guys were just great. I instantly made friends with all of them. They were a great crowd. And so I would probably be hanging around the makeup trailers whether Doug was there or not, because I just liked hanging with those guys. But that was always fun. But it was exhausting for Doug. It was a 3-hour makeup for sure. I think that was the average. I think by And obviously, Doug would request each time, we speed it up. And I think by the time Gary was doing it, he might have got it down to, I'm sure you know the process. It's like application of various pieces, which is the time is taken by the touching up and the bits in between to make it seamless.
Yeah.
So again, this is very nuts and bolts and inside baseball. I apologize, but it's really the number of application pieces is a factor in the length of time. And I think I'm right in saying that Gary managed to get it down to, I'm just pulling a number out of my arsehole, what I'm saying. I was going to say 4. It's probably more than that. But so I think the record, shortest time, Gary definitely holds the record for the shortest time putting it on, Doug. I think he got it down to 2 hours and a couple of minutes once. But yeah, for the most part, it's you know. I mean, that's why it's good that the image animation lads are fun, because you're just sitting there and, you know, but they are scurrilous, foul-mouthed, funny guys.
Yeah.
So, you know, it could have been worse. And it's very interesting which actors can cope and which actors get really ratty and miserable. And if you think I'm going to name any names, but Doug was a trooper, I will say that. And you know, as you probably know, I got to play a minor Cenobite in Hellraiser 3, so I too have suffered through that process, except really, because Barbie's mask was an existing mask, so it could come on as one big piece, and then Bob Keane would adjust. So I had the process, but I think the maximum time I was in the chair was 35, 40 minutes. So that was it wasn't multiple hours the way some of these guys have to suffer.
It was a strange mixture of American actors and English actors in the first film, and
accents.
Yeah, and accents. Yeah, because I remember I watched it again, and again I got confused because they kept talking about it being set in London.
Yeah, right. Where did that movie take place?
Yeah,
we've no fucking idea, Sean. We don't know. It took place in Hellraiser land because it was shot. Obviously, you know, it was literally shot in London. It was shot in Cricklewood. Dollis Hill. Was the neighborhood. Oh God, and I want to say, obviously, it's not Ludovico Street because that's the fictional name. Is it Doris Hill Lane itself? Dollis Hill?
I don't know.
I'm sure there's a blue plaque there now, Sean. You know. But it was a real location. It was a real house. And then they had a little studio, little production village for some of the interiors and the other stuff. And then by the time we were doing Hellbound, we shot, which was fantastic for all of us, as movie buff kids growing up. We were shooting at Pinewood where, Powell and Pressburger had made movies. All the James Bond movies were there. I was going to say Star Wars, but that would be a lie. But my very first day on a film set, so, I was thrilled enough that I got to write a movie. And now I was being taken down to Pinewood to, I guess it wasn't the first day of shooting. It was what they call pre-production. And I get out the car at Pinewood and I walk in. I know where I've been told where to go. I can't remember which it was, lot 17 or whatever. And I walked down the fucking middle of Gotham City because they just finished filming Tim Burton's Batman.
Right.
Funny connection with the Michael McDowell thing there. And they hadn't thrown the set down yet. The movie was wrapped and none of the cast were there. But so I walked down Gotham and it's like, I guess I'm in the film business now. It was very cool. But yeah, and so we were shooting at Pinewood, and we knew what had happened with the first one, which was New World had liked the movie, but they were concerned Oh, that's what I was going to say. They shot it in Cricklewood, and it was a British movie.
Yeah.
In Clive and Chris's head, I think, we were going to be the new Hammer. That was what we wanted to be, the new Hammer films, make British horror movies, hopefully for an international audience, but also for a British audience. But New World, I'm not sure entirely what the logic was. I don't know if it was as literal-minded as we can't understand some of the accents.
Yeah.
Or whether it was a more, which might be even odder. I mean, because at least you could understand that. If it was like they're too fucking Cockney for us, we can't get it. But I don't think it was that. I think it was a vague sense that, well, horror films should be American. I'm not sure. I was just a friend of the court on the first movie. I had nothing to do with it. But for whatever reason, they dubbed a lot of the secondary roles. None of the lead. I mean, obviously, Ashley was playing American, and Andrew was playing American, and so I guess Sean was playing American. So he was faking an American accent. I lose track. But for the most part, our primary actors were speaking with their own voices, and that remained uninterfered with, thank God. But some of the secondary roles were dubbed, which gave this sort of bizarre, exactly as you put your finger on the "where are we" question. That you do see a double-decker bus go past at one point, don't you? When actually,
I think there's an intercity train as well.
Oh, right. So it's clearly England, but it's an imaginary England populated by Americans, So when we were doing Hellbound, we were conscious of the fact that we had to make a decision one way or the other. So, and clearly we knew if New World was going to have a prejudice, it would be in that direction. So we just quietly assumed that the events of Hellraiser had taken place in America, and now this was the sequel taking place in America. But we were shooting at Pinewood, and it was all British actors. And so it's still, it's still a kind of no man's land. It's an island somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, Sean, which we should all visit, and it's called Ingmerica. But so that was why because the cops have guns, so clearly we were saying, because you see the cops quite early in Hellbound, they blow a corpse apart. So we were saying this was America immediately once you have the guns on the cops, but of course then you have the great Ken Cranham with his beautiful, fruity, theatrical acoustic, if you could. So, it's the Chennard Institute, but clearly this is an expat Brit who's... So, sadly, I can throw no actual light on that other than to say, yes, you're right to spot the geographical connection.
I love your vision of hell in Hellbound. Where did that come from? It's a difficult question.
I missed the first two words. I'm sorry, Sean. The visual. Did you...
Yeah, so the visuals for Hell, I loved it.
Oh, sure.
Anything?
Well, the labyrinth itself was clearly ripped off from MC. Is it Escher or Escher? I've never known.
Oh, yeah.
But the guy with the funny landscapes that trick the eye, and what we. Well, it's interesting, actually. I'll give you an example. I'd said earlier that, I would regard, if we were really saying who came up with things, and I said, Tony, the story, as you finally see it, really was me, Clive, and Tony. Though I'd like to stress I wrote every word of the script. But one of the things that Tony is responsible for, it was a collaborative thing, but when the initial story that Clive and I came up with, we certainly didn't have fire and brimstone. We didn't want the traditional, horned devils.
Yeah.
Fire and Brimstone. But it was a little less orderly and scientific. In fact, Leviathan, which in the movie ends up as the great, inverted dual pyramid, whatever the hell that shape is called in the sky, was a much more oozy, gloopy, Lovecraftian monster in a bowl-shaped pit in the middle of hell. And we changed that for a couple of reasons. One of which is we couldn't afford it because the way I'd written it in the first draft, he was literally giving birth to Cenobites. They were like, so we would have had to have built. Anyway, it's a little ambitious, but also Tony was, although he was a horror movie fan, he was really much more a science fiction fan. And I was much more of a horror fan, but a bit of a science fiction fan. So I was not resistant when he kept making visual references, not to all the shit I'd make visual references to, which would be Bride of Frankenstein and stuff like that. Yeah. He'd make these references. This is back when he and I are sort of working together on the fourth draft in another London hotel, but with a computer this time. And all the references he would make in conversation would be to things like Forbidden Planet of 2001.
Right.
And eventually I said, you know that you're citing science fiction movies all the time here. And, he sort of shrugged his, well, I like science fiction. And so, as I'm sure you know, Sean, it's not like, I hate that phrase, the creative process, but the creative process is really organic rather than formalistic. So I don't think at once, it wasn't like I said, it's science fiction-y, and he said, I like science fiction. And then a light bulb went on and we said, we shall create a science fiction-looking hell. So neither of us said that, but by the end of our sessions, hell had become, and specifically Leviathan had become the sort of more visually related to the box. And that the Isha-like landscape, I want to give Tony full credit for that. I bet he just said, I want it to look like a Isha-like labyrinth, I think.
Right.
So that evolved over the course of both the writing and the storyboard development and stuff.
Did the censors make you cut anything out of it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But the thing is, and again, I think this is something Chris knew, having done his time in the trenches before putting his fancy producer's hat on. He taught Clive before the first movie, and then by extension taught us for the second, that you always throw a few extra things in there, throw a few extra Christians to the lions, so that if you just give them the nasty shit you want, they will trim that. If you give them the nasty shit you want, and even nastier shit on either end of it, they'll cut that or request. This is back in the days. Do you still have the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification?
I think you do, yeah. I'm not sure it works so, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, so assuming it's the same now as well, what it was then was to get the, I assume actually Hellbound was an X in the UK, was it? I don't know.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, because nobody wanted an X in the US because it was very different. X usually implied pornography, and whereas X, certainly when I did watch your movies, X was just, you had to be 17 to, 16, can't remember, to watch it. And the thing with the BBFC was they could just refuse to classify the movie if you didn't know it. So what you were looking for was, and again, I can't remember, did we have double A's and PG-13s? Then I'm not sure what they were, but we knew that we had to make them happy, because if you didn't get a certificate, your film wasn't, quote, banned in any way, but the big chains wouldn't show it because, you know, they have a deal. I don't know how formal it is, but you need to be approved by the BBFC before the Odeons and the ABCs or whatever they are these days would show them. So we would always put a few extra nasty bits in, which went for sex as well as violence. There's more sex in Hellraiser than Hellbound, so I don't think we had any. Did we have a nudity issue? There's a couple of people. There's a threesome writhing around in a pit somewhere in Hellbound. There might have been we might have had to clip 3 frames because there might have been a nipple. But the nastiness, we did have to trim. And of course, the famous sequence is Browning slashing himself to pieces with the open razor on the mattress. So, we threw even more blood at it, and he made a few more cuts. I think the one across the groin stayed in.
Right.
I can't remember because, of course, the movie has since been released in not unedited, uncensored versions on all the formats. So I can't remember what was in and what wasn't.
Right.
But yes, we did have to make some trims, and also I'm not surprised we had to make some trims on that because that was a very salutary lesson for me actually because I think I'm a tough guy sitting there in Hampstead typing away. Chenard hands him the razor. He slashes his arm. 4 pages of describing this hideous, horrible shit. I think, yeah, look at this. Look how tough I am. And then similarly, I was there when we shot it. And, there's 20 of us standing in a room and there's a couple of image animation guys literally pumping blood. Long valves. So it's all very unpleasant because it's a bunch of us making pragmatic things happen. And you got a great, very committed performance by Oliver as Browning. But it wasn't, it sounds weird to say it wasn't disturbing given how horrible the visuals were. But in the room filming it wasn't that disturbing because, things would go wrong. We'd have to break, reset the camera. Ken Cranham would have to wipe the blood off his face and swear to him again for the next one. So it was very undisturbing there too. And we were all egging each other on, more blood. And I think it was, I had not specified slash the groin because, one has standards, sure. But while we were shooting it, Robin Vidgeon, who was the DP, great DP, who had worked with Ken Russell, and a man of great gravitas, but also great sense of humour, but very understated as well. So Oliver's slashing away, and we're saying, more blood, pump, pump, pump. And then quietly from behind the camera, we hear Robin say, what about one across the balls, Tone? To Tony, and Tony and I looked at each other and good idea. I should have thought of that. So that was Robin's contribution to that nationalism. But anyway, the point I was going to make was obviously this was on one of the times I was down there, so I'd seen the shooting, but the next morning we watched the rushes or dailies as they call them, and I hadn't had me brekkie. And it was 7:30 on a cold, miserable Pinewood morning. And I'm sure, as you know, with dailies, all you get, clearly there's no soundtrack music. There's no fully mixed dialogue. You might have caught, you've got a rough mix of what was caught by the mics on the day. And it's just footage after footage after footage, take after take after take. So it all looks a bit documentary-like. And at 7:30 on that cold, miserable morning, watching Oliver slash himself to pieces with gallons of blood and, in his imagination, icky insects pouring out of the wounds, it was really disgusting. And I thought, wow, who comes up with this shit? And I actually remember thinking, not in a we're going to be in trouble for this way, but in a, oh no, we should way. It was like, oh, we're going to need to cut this carefully, so that because it was kind of nauseating. So it was like it was a lesson in the power of finished film for me.
Yeah.
And I think my memory is surprisingly, we didn't suffer that much from the BBFC. As I said, we thrown some questions to the lines. We put stuff in there deliberately exaggerated so that we could say, yep, we've trimmed 4 seconds from here and 17 seconds from here and whatever. So it wasn't, it was okay. You know, the movie was pretty much what we wanted it to be. I think. A long time ago, sure.